Okay, now we're online, and now we're recording. And I do want to ask all of our friends to open their cameras so we can watch each other. You're gonna have slides, Michael, or just discussion? Okay, so we can leave it. We can leave this. I'll just maybe stop the share screen and just open up all the slides. So thank you very much, Warren and Michael, for joining us and for answering my invitation. I just start with a very short introduction, like personal perspective, and then we just wanna just open up this discussion. You know, a year ago when we started the Corona with the COVID-19, when everything just fell upon us, the halting of life in all of its form, I was quite depressed, because people were going around. People that did continue to go to work said that they're essential workers. They have to go to work. Why? Because they're essential workers. They do something essential for humankind or for the local community or whatever. And I was going around, well, I don't think I'm that essential. Like, how am I essential? How the issue of CSR is essential? How the issue of sustainability is essential, and to whom? And I was quite depressed. Like, now I need to know, to reshape myself in a new practice. And then the dynamic that happened, especially in the last 6 months or so, in the issue of ESG, impact, sustainability, CSR, is really overwhelming. I've been practicing this discipline for the last 15 years or more, and it has never been. It's like this kind of explosion, like it's all over us, and I've been working so tirelessly just to be up to date, new methodologies, new standards, new initiatives, new organization. It's amazing, really. And one of the things that really kept me above water is the ongoing flow of books from Amazon. I've been almost buying everything I could about this issue of impact of CSR, whatever, but I've been doing that for the last 10 years or more. And I've been reading all the time books. And I think that your book really caught not my eye, but my attention, the way it's been so clearly articulated with the real kind of a blueprint how things should be rolled out from here now, about the social contract, about all of those issues. And I do want to introduce you shortly before I give you the stage. And we're not going to summarize the whole book in an hour or so. I think we're going to just touch kind of some key points, and also ask for all the participants to share their thoughts, their ideas, to have this kind of an open discussion. So a little bit about you and Warren. So Michael O'Leary was on the founding team of Bain Capital's Social Impact Fund. Previously, he invested in consumer, industrial, and technology companies through Bain Capital Private Equity Fund. He has served as an economic policy advisor in the United States Senate and on 2 presidential campaigns. Michael studied philosophy at Harvard College and earned his MBA from the Stanford Graduation School of Business. He lives in New York. Warren Valdemanis leads a social impact fund that invests in the American workforce. He was previously a managing director with Bain Capital's Social Impact Fund, and before that invested in Bain Capital's private equity team for over a decade. He grew up in Canada and has lived and worked in Australia, Chile, France, Hong Kong, Japan, South Africa, and the United States. Warren studied economics at Dartmouth College and earned his MBA from Harvard Business School. He lives with his wife, Christine, and 4 children in Portland, Maine. So Michael and Warren, the stage is yours, and I'll continue, and we will continue after your kind of introduction of what you want to share with us. Please, Michael.
Well, thank you, Liad, for having us today. It's a pleasure to be doing a chat with you there in Israel. I wish we were there with you in person. It's actually interesting. This is our second discussion in the region this week along these lines. We actually had a chat earlier in the week at the American University of Cairo, which was really, really cool, and it speaks to, I think, the prevalence of this topic now around the world. And as you mentioned, Liad, it is a big topic. It's a topic that can be incredibly daunting at times. How do we make capitalism more responsible? But it's a topic also where there's an incredible amount of energy. And I think Michael and I have seen this, over the 5 years or so that we've been involved in impact investing. We've seen it go from really a very niche, very kind of, offbeat kind of thing to be doing to a much more, central conversation across, academia, business, government, et cetera. So which we find really exciting. Maybe just to give a little bit of an intro into our book and our thesis to start the conversation. Michael and I, just to set the table, we're fervent capitalists. We believe in the system. We believe the system has a lot of power for good. When we think about that, consider the following. In the 3,000 years up to 1750, GDP per capita basically grew not at all. Basically no meaningful change over all that time in the standard of living for humans. Since 1750, GDP per capita has grown by 37 times. And in just the last 30 years alone, we've lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty. And so these things didn't happen by accident, they happened by capitalism. The 1750 is around the time when the limited liability joint stock corporation started to be in evidence in any meaningful way, particularly in Europe and in the United States. And so, we believe that capitalism is an incredibly powerful vehicle. At the same time, as practiced in particularly the United States, but also in some other countries in the last 40 or so years, capitalism has also delivered some fairly distorted results. So here's another troubling statistic. In Boston, in the place where Michael and I worked for many years, the life expectancy gap between an adjacent rich and poor neighborhood is 33 years. 33-year life expectancy gap in 2020 in America. And that's not an isolated statistic. In fact, there are very similar statistics in other big cities across the United States. And that also, we think, is a product of capitalism. A form of capitalism that ceases to value workers in the way it used to, a form of capitalism that continues to disregard important things related to the environment, and frankly, a form of capitalism that we think is doing a less good job of serving all of us, including investors and people who own shares of companies. So we decided that we wanted to kind of try to get underneath what is it that has gone wrong? What is it that has taken us over these past 40 or 50 years in this direction? And there are lots of books about capitalism. There are books by virtuous CEOs who talk about their experiences in building values-based companies. There are books like Thomas Piketty's that talk about policy. There was, I think it was in vogue for a while to have Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century on your shelf, whether you actually read it or not, separate question. But Piketty himself mentions the French Revolution more often than he mentions the corporation. In other words, he's talking about policy ideas and some fairly abstract notions, but capitalism gets implemented by companies. And so we decided to write a book about companies. And what is it about companies today that make them relatively poor conduits of social values? Because companies, like other social institutions, are just made up of people. So you would think that they would, the people would bring their values with them into the corporation, but often they do not. So the fundamental basic unit of analysis of our book is the corporation. And we look and say, fundamentally, if you want to change the corporation, the CEO, of course, matters. The management team matters. But they serve at the pleasure of their boards, who are representatives of owners. And if we've learned one thing through our lives as impact investors, it's that if you want to transmit values, you need owners to be on side. So that was really the starting point for our book. And I'll turn it over to Michael in a second, but I'll just say that one of the things that you might sort of hear if you sort of read a little bit about ESG and CSR, environmental, social, and government stuff, and corporate social responsibility, is that over $100 trillion of investment capital has signed on to the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. The Business Roundtable in the United States, which represents 180 or so CEOs of top corporations, has said that they believe in stakeholder capitalism. There's all this stuff out there, all this talk. And the talk, we think, represents a victory on the field of battle of ideas. But we're worried about losing the war of substantive action. Because you would think with all this talk that capitalism would already be back on a much more sustainable track, and it isn't yet. So the big question for us is, how do we turn energy and talk into lasting results? And Michael, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, there was a great moment in the summer of 2019 as we were working on the book, right after the Business Roundtable had come out with their statement. Is the Business Roundtable, in many ways, Iliad, you know this better than anyone, folks following this space, it's inspiring to finally see these ideas get traction at such a high level, where these are the CEOs of the largest companies in America, the largest banks, the largest insurance companies, people who truly do hold the reins of power in the American economy and the global economy. And they had come together and said that we believe that the purpose of a corporation is not just to make profits for shareholders, what has been kind of stricture over the last, called 30 years, 40 years in the American economy, but instead the purpose of the corporation is to serve all of its stakeholders, wages and skills for workers and healthy life-sustaining products for customers and being responsible stewards of the environment. And there was this amazing moment because Warren and I saw this announcement, and then part of us says like, oh damn, we're trying to write a book about this and it's already come to pass. Everything we were going to advocate for is already happening. And then shortly after the announcement, a different group issued a response. This was the Council of Institutional Investors, which is another trade organization, but instead of being managers and CEOs, the Council of Institutional Investors represents the big asset managers, the big asset owners in America. So a lot of pension funds like the California Teachers Pension Fund or the New York Firefighters Pension Fund, and a lot of asset managers, these multi-trillion-dollar firms like BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street. And what they issued in response was essentially a splash of cold water. They said, dear CEOs, it's all well and good that you now believe in serving workers and customers and communities and the environment, all that. But just one reminder, you serve at the pleasure of the board who's appointed by shareholders. And this is the beautiful and terrible thing about a capitalist economy is that at the end of the day, the capitalist is king. And so, the Council of Institutional Investors essentially said all of this happy talk on purpose and corporate social responsibility and sustainability, all of it is totally fine as long as what you're really doing is serving shareholders, right? That was the reminder. And I think it was a great moment because it really embodied these contradictory demands that companies are having to deal with today. Because they are being told, on the one hand, from stakeholders, from governments, social media, from the workers, your job is to serve more than just the bottom line. Your job is to serve society, serve the environment. And at the same time, they're getting conflicting demands from their shareholders to maximize profits, maximize share price, quarterly earnings. And when faced with these kind of conflicting, contradictory demands, so many companies are responding with a sort of rational hypocrisy, where they say different things to different audiences, where they change superficial aspects of the company, the 1/3 of 1% of revenue that they donate each year, without actually changing the core of what they do. And the best example of this is in companies that issue separate corporate social responsibility reports from their annual reports to shareholders, where when you hold them side by side, you're hard pressed to see the connection between the two. One example Warren and I pointed to in the book was Goldman Sachs, which if you read their corporate social responsibility report, they wax poetic about their 10,000 Women Initiative, where they're investing in women around the world. Truly a great program that we laud. We think is a wonderful use of capital, a wonderful use of resources. But then if you look at their annual report to shareholders, they don't talk about women. They don't talk about gender. The only time they bring up the words female or women or gender is in relations to a gender pay disparity lawsuit ongoing in the UK. And so, I think such a big aspect of getting companies to start walking the talk more is we need to put in better accountability mechanisms. That's why we called the book Accountable. I think what we see as one of the core problems in this movement today is that if you poll CEOs and you say, is serving stakeholders beyond shareholders important? 9 out of 10 will agree. You'd be hard pressed to find a business leader or an investor today who does not at least pay lip service to the notion of stakeholder capitalism or social responsibility or sustainability. The issue is if you then ask them, are you satisfied with the job your company is doing on these issues, that 96% of them will say, yes, I think companies should be serving more than shareholders, and my company is doing a good job at it. This is the disconnect. And this is the disconnect that we think requires more than just shifting the edges, more than just shifting a marketing campaign or the messaging. You have to shift the mission, the purpose of an organization. And Warren, why don't we take another couple minutes if you want to just talk quickly about what we mean by purpose. That's such a core part of the book. And then maybe we can turn back to questions after that.
Sure. Just very quickly on purpose. It's interesting. We talk about purpose these days as though it's some new idea, but when corporations were first getting started, every single company had to declare its purpose to either to the crown or to the government, because there was this idea of reciprocal obligation. If the government's going to confer on you the benefits of limited liability and other benefits with the corporate form, then you have a social responsibility in return. And it's interesting in the articles of incorporation, at least for American companies, I think it's true in other jurisdictions as well, there's still this purpose clause. But in America, most people just write to do what's lawful in the state of Delaware. Like that's the purpose of the company, which isn't exactly inspiring. Our view is that purpose is sort of the hallmark of strategy, that if you don't know what a company's for, it's really hard to make strategic trade-offs. But it's also an important motivating tool for workers. It's important motivating tool, frankly, for anyone involved in a company's ecosystem. And so our view is that if you're going to start trying to solve the corporate problem, you need owners to give accountability to companies through a clear articulation of their purpose, and then creating alignment around that purpose across the organization. And we can talk about some of the tools to do that. The good news is some companies are beginning to do this. You may have read that a few months back, Danone, the French food giant, took their described their purpose and put it into their charter. I think it was something like to spread good health to as many people through food to as many people as possible, which is an inspiring purpose. And once you have a purpose like that, you can then begin to measure and say, how am I doing at that purpose? And so, our hope is that we're going to see more actions like that are more than just sort of statements of good intent. There are clear actions that actually have some sort of lasting impact on the way companies behave. And so maybe with that, Michael, unless you've got anything to add, we'd love to turn it over and have a discussion.
Yeah, I think we're gonna stay a little bit at the beginning of the story, not just jump to where we are today. And I think that's it's a crucial part of this narrative. And I do want to start, my first question from a quote from your book, but you touched that in a very lightly, but I'll because you wrote it so nicely, so I'll just read it again, and then I get to the answer. And you said that corporations were once regularly evaluated against their social purpose by the state legislatures that chartered them. If they violated the charters, they were said to have acted ultra vires or beyond their powers. State legislatures could revoke their charter. States no longer exercise that power, but we as a society will still do. This is what the diverse Harvard movement seeks to take away oil and gas companies' license to operate effectively, to revoke their charters. And as we know, corporations started the way, as what you said, the chartered corporations with clear stipulations about what they can do and what they cannot do. And things got out of hand a little bit, not a little bit, quite a lot in the last decade or so. And the question is, can we harness back, or can we cage back this corporate entity into this borderlines of the government? Can this process be undone, at your opinion?
Oh, it's a great question. There's a lot of proposals I spent some time working in the Democratic primary for this last election. And a lot of the proposals, especially coming from politicians like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, folks who are kind of on the more progressive end of the political spectrum, related back to this. In fact, Elizabeth Warren in her, I think what you call the Accountable Capitalism Act, suggested essentially this same sort of proposal: create a federal commission that assesses a company's purpose, its ability to deliver against that purpose, and has the power, as state legislatures once did, to revoke the charter of companies that consistently act in the public's harm or consistently break the law. Now, it's a good question. Is this something we should want to go back to? And I think part of answering that question is to look back at why we eliminated it in the first place. As Warren had said, when the first corporations were chartered, very explicit. They had to charter around a specific purpose. They were at risk of having their charter revoked. If you go back and look at the corporate charters of the early companies in America, I think one we mentioned in the book was the Granite Railway Company in Massachusetts, that when it wanted to go get its charter, which we should remember, the reason why state legislatures were getting involved in this, they weren't in charge of approving whether any given company can start. If you just wanted to start your own farm or your own small workshop, you weren't going to the state legislature with hat in hand asking for it. It was when people wanted to form corporations with the rights of having limited liability, for instance, so that owners couldn't lose more than the money they initially put in, or freely transferable shares, so you could sell your share in the company, create liquidity. That those were very rightly considered privileges that were bestowed upon organizations, and therefore, in exchange for those privileges, the state or the crown wanted to see what purpose you were going to be serving. And that worked relatively well, but by the middle of the 19th century in the United States, and similar times in Europe as well, they realized that going to a state legislature to ask for a charter, you risked having a lot of graft, a lot of corruption, where a lot of special favors, where if you were trying to start a new company that was going to compete with an existing company, that existing company would go and lobby the state legislature and say, you shouldn't grant this charter. And they would make all sorts of public-minded reasons, but essentially it was anti-competitive. And so at the same time, you had all this risk of corruption, anti-competitive behavior. You also were just gumming up the works of the state legislature. This was a huge concern at a time when the economy was trying to grow so quickly, and we were going from having hundreds of corporations in the United States, having thousands and tens of thousands, and today hundreds of thousands. And so they did away with it because they thought the government is actually in a very precarious position, granting and taking away these charters. So to just turn back the clock and go back to exactly how it was before is probably not what we'd want to do. But I think one thing you are seeing that is very in line with the spirit of that law are stewardship codes, for instance. So these are stewardship codes like in the UK or in Japan that try and say much more explicitly, here are the responsibilities that investors have in this case. Where we've gotten so used to this idea that corporations have a set of responsibilities to investors. They've got these fiduciary duties that a company cannot be wasting investor money on pet projects or on perks for managers. A company is owned by the shareholders, and it should act responsibly as stewards of that capital. And yet there was no reciprocal obligation. There was no responsibilities that the investors then had back to the corporation. And what we're seeing, and this is still new, and these things are being revised over time, and they're getting more teeth slowly but surely, that we're seeing people start to recognize that maybe there should be reciprocal obligations back, that an investor should be working in the best interest of the company and stakeholders over the long term as well, and shouldn't be taking actions that are good in the short term but bad in the long term, or good for shareholders but end up hollowing out the company. So I think there are some sort of legislative solutions here, but it doesn't necessarily look like it did in the past.
Yeah, I do want to add to that, also in regards to Warren's example about Danone. I think something that also can be an example of your kind of conclusion, that Danone as a French company is obligated to publish its purpose with the French law. It's called entreprise à mission, which means a company, they must have a stipulation of their purpose as part of all of their legal documents. And we had a seminar about that about a couple of months ago with a lawyer that took part in the articulation of this law. And it's a very, very interesting thing about how lawyers are engaged with corporations in France in writing down their social purpose. So that's kind of very interesting.
One short anecdote on that, because we have the American equivalent is the benefit corporation statutes, where you can now form as a benefit corporation in the US. You put your purpose in your charter, you commit to a certain amount of sustainability reporting, a certain amount of serving your stakeholders beyond just shareholders. And my new investment firm that I'm a part of, Engine Number One, we formed as a benefit corporation. We put our purpose into our charter. And the amazing thing about that process was we spoke with a bunch of lawyers, as any new investment firm does, and so many lawyers, I would guess 90%, 95% of the lawyers we talked to had 1,000 reasons why, oh, it doesn't make sense to do that. Oh, the traditional way is better. You can do anything you'd want to do in the benefit corporation statutes with a C corporation. And it was the select few that saw the value in creating a company that is explicitly mission oriented all the way down to legal charter. And just shows how early we are, I think, in the evolution of thinking here, where so many people are still kind of in the old era of doing good, mission, all of that's kind of a philanthropic side pursuit, but it's not core to the company. We're just starting to see that transition.
Yeah,
sorry, I'll just comment on that because I just read this morning, actually. It was kind of interesting that at JP Morgan Chase, the CEO there, Jamie Dimon, who was a signatory to the Business Roundtable purpose statement, has proposed that JP Morgan Chase become a public benefit company in line with the Delaware framework. And that proposal has been rejected by the board of JP Morgan Chase. Commentators are saying, well, they may have signed on to the Business Roundtable, but actually investors come first, and they really don't want to go all the way. They just want to, get the benefit of being seen to be BIT signatory.
It's a great example of what Warren said earlier, where unless you have the investors on board, CEOs can only go so far. Now, I might argue in this case, though, a board is different than the investors, right? The board supposedly represents the investors. I wouldn't be surprised if you put this to an investor vote. It could fail. It absolutely could fail. There's a lot of traditional investors out there, a lot of traditional asset managers. It could also pass, but the board is not a perfect representation of what the actual investor base believes. And I could imagine, especially if Jamie Dimon were supporting it, I could see it passing.
But the real question that I think that we've got to find better answers to is, does doing things like this ultimately help a company or hurt it? And our belief is that actually, when we've gone with smaller companies, that I invest in medium-sized companies. When we go and we help a company clarify its mission, you actually see all kinds of really good things happen as a result. You get more clarity around your strategic decision making. You get more alignment at your most senior level of the company. You end up with more motivation, often through the ranks of the company, because people are motivated by that mission over and above just making money for whoever the shareholders happen to be. Lots of good things happen. And so our hope is that if you can create enough evidence that this is actually in the long-term interest of shareholders to do things like this, then the board of JP Morgan may say no this time, but like Michael said, their shareholders will ultimately pressure them to see the light. But more importantly, perhaps, this will become more broadly adopted across all banks and all large companies. And so we think that one of the solutions here is trying to create an evidence base that taking actions like Danone's actually works, that it actually helps. And so when we describe impact investors as operating in the lab where capitalists work to reform capitalism, it's things like this that we're doing, where we think we can actually sort of create the evidence base that will empower others to follow, hopefully.
Yeah, great. If someone from our friends want to ask a question, do raise your hand or just, I don't know, just give me a note, because I have enough questions. I've been thinking that if I would be stranded in a lonely island, I wouldn't take the book. I would take the authors of the book. But I do want to ask something about something which is not very much mentioned in the book, and that's alternative business models. And that's something you didn't touch quite a lot in the books about. Can we meddle or change, I don't know, the genetic structure of the business corporation, which means with the pro-profit profit-creating models with alternatives such as cooperatives, such as social entrepreneurship, such as NGOs that are building up, I don't know, not for profit, but revenue-generating kind of products and services. Can we just, because you're going with the stream, but I'm asking other business streams that we can, I don't know, look as alternatives to this corporate domination?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, Liad, because we haven't heard as many questions about things like cooperatives here in the United States, although we did have that same question just a couple of days ago in the session that we did with the American University of Cairo. And it does seem like there are models in other countries that we could learn from in the United States, for sure. You know, our starting point for for the book was, we've got all these big corporations already, and what are we going to do to drag them further in the direction of responsible business practices? And one of the statistics we cite in the book is I think the Fortune 500, the combined revenue of the Fortune 500 companies is something like 2/3 of the GDP of the U.S. So it's a huge, these companies have a huge influence on what happens today in capitalism. And so we were starting with kind of the premise that to reform capitalism soon, you've got to get these Goliaths and drag them in the direction of more sustainable practices. Now, I think experiments like impact investing, which happen very much below those large companies for the most part, I think experiments there. Our big question in impact investing is, how do you scale the principles? And I think the same question could be asked of cooperatives. How do you scale those principles into larger corporations? But certainly based on what I know of cooperatives, I think there's a lot to like about that.
Yeah, I love the question, because before I was even in the impact investing world, I had worked on the legislative side and passing a budget amendment that would fund in the state of Massachusetts a worker ownership center, all focused on how do you create and convert more worker-owned companies. So more of this kind of alternative business model pathway. And as Warren said, for our book, we ended up focusing much more on what do you do with the existing Fortune 500. And as much as I love that model, and I think there's a lot of innovative solutions around worker cooperatives, employee ownership specifically, when you're talking about starting new companies, social enterprises, even converting existing companies that are kind of family owned or single proprietor as they retire and are looking on how do they sell the business to the next owner. The jury's still out on how do you convert much larger businesses, especially if you're, I think there's, if you divide, this is extremely rough, but if you divide, the solution sets around reforming capitalism into, win-win and win-lose, right? Like there are plenty of proposals, like Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, they proposed, give 8% of equity away from current shareholders to workers, 8% away every year for 5 years, so that workers own 40% of all public companies, which is, in some ways, if you're if you're looking at the problems of inequality and you're looking at the problems of worker ownership, is a wonderful proposal, but in many ways is absolutely dead on arrival, because you're literally, it's as clear redistribution as you can get. Some amount of worker ownership does improve the overall value of the company, but for the most part, you're just taking ownership from one group and giving it to another, which is clearly win-lose. And I think the beautiful thing about the current moment in this movement is there are so many things that corporations, investors can be doing that are win-win, that are beneficial to both the long-term value of the company, stability of the company, growth of the company, as well as benefiting customers and workers, the environment, other stakeholders. And so Warren and I, mostly in our careers now and in the book, focused on those sorts of solutions, thinking that there's still so much room to go there before we start getting to the much harder things where we're, being more redistributive. But I think that's going to be the struggle of scaling some of those business models today, is what do you do with the big public companies?
Yeah, it's the issue of scale, undoubtedly. And in Israel, we have corporations here for more than, I think, 80 years or more, with the kibbutzim, with the first corporation, I think, came from people that came from Russia, from kind of the collaborative background and things like that. So it's very much part of the discussion here because it's a common way of life. Everyone knows what a cooperative is. But the issue is of scale, and can we take that to the big league?
Oftentimes people point in the US, people point to like Publix supermarkets, these big, I think probably similar, we have fewer of them, but these, really large scale businesses that are worker owned or structured as cooperatives. And they say, if this big supermarket can do it, why can't Walmart do it or Costco or these other firms? And the struggle is all of the big ones started from the very beginning. They started as being worker owned, and then they grew, which I think makes a lot of sense. The trickier thing is, they didn't convert to that. The ones that convert to it are much smaller when they convert.
Yeah. So I want the next question that we have with us, Ophir. Ophir, if you can open up your camera. Ophir, אם אתה יכול לפתוח את המצלמה. Well, Ophir, Ophir, do you hear us? Okay, never mind. If you can just open up. But Ophir is a student of law and accounting, and that really leads me to the next question, and that's the issue of the median shareholder, but the issue of institutional investors. I think for me this concept was the real revelation, because it really made sense. So I'll hand it back to you. Can you just describe what do you mean by the concept of the median shareholder, and how do you use this concept in practicing ESG policies in institutional investors, which represent millions of people? That they're not impact investors. They are here to represent millions, and most of them really are worried about their pensions.
Yeah, I think there's a common way to tell the story of capitalism over the last 50 years that says, at least in the United States, that says, post-war, post-World War II, we had this period where CEOs balanced all the interests of shareholders and stakeholders, and everyone was kind of rising together. And then around 1970 into the 1980s, we kind of split. And it became, and the story of capitalism since then has been one of shareholders versus stakeholders. And shareholders have been winning at the expense of stakeholders, which as a narrative is very simple and is very compelling. But what Warren and I wanted to do in the book was to pull back one layer and say, well, who are these shareholders? And I think the amazing thing, partly I think the inspiration for this was, thinking of all the things that are done on behalf of shareholders, firing workers or outsourcing jobs or polluting the environment. And this thought, that I would have personally of, I own through my retirement account, something like 15,000 companies around the world, right? Just through index funds and all of that. And so I'm a shareholder that apparently, supposedly these companies are working on behalf of, but, I as a shareholder, vehemently disagree with a lot of the actions corporations are taking. And when you look at the data, there's a whole lot more shareholders like me than there are, the rapacious billionaire shareholder who wants to maximize profits at all costs. So here's what the data says in the United States. I assume it's similar around the world. The median shareholder, if you line up all the shareholders in America on a line, the exact median shareholder is 51 years old. They've got $65,000 in their retirement account. In their retirement account, they usually own mutual funds, index funds that are broadly diversified around the globe. And so if you just stop there and just think of them in terms of them being a shareholder, you'd say their best interest is never in maximizing share price at one company in one quarter. Their best interests are in maximizing the broader economic growth over decades. Because the way the law works in the US, they can't even access the retirement savings if they're 51 years old for another 14 or 15 years, right? And they're so broadly diversified that if an oil and gas company is maximizing profits by polluting the environment in ways that precipitate climate change, that actually ends up harming their portfolio overall, right? It doesn't help them to have some company doing that. And so, their interests are, as I said, kind of the sustainable development of the global economy. And you go one layer deeper and you say, if you're 51 years old with $65,000 in a retirement account, you are a shareholder, yes, but you're also a worker. And in fact, much, much more of your money comes from what you're making through your wages than what you're making through dividends or capital gains through your portfolio. And so, when you step back from just the role as a shareholder and consider their other roles as an employee and as a customer of these companies, as a neighbor of these companies, as a citizen of the democracies these companies affect, suddenly that really expands, your interests. So then you say, if I'm a corporation, I'm trying to think about what serves my shareholders. There's this kind of defunct theory of the efficient capital markets that says, it's complicated. You have shareholders who are holding for a short period, for a long period. The right thing to do is just maximize share price, and that kind of serves all of your shareholders equally well. But the moment you start thinking about, your median shareholder, not just some shareholders focused on maximizing share price today, I think that then kind of expands towards the more Jamie Dimon school of thought of, serving my shareholders probably means setting things up as a benefit corporation, focusing on long-term impacts, focusing on how my company is affecting all of its stakeholders, and focusing on operating a business in a way that helps the sustainable, broader global development of the economy, because that's what actually serves my shareholders.
And do you know about institutional investors who are really practicing this kind of mega stakeholder engagement to get the perspective, the long-term perspective of this kind of median shareholder, not the imaginary one, but really kind of build up the prototype?
Yeah, in the academic literature, oftentimes this idea is referred to as the universal owner hypothesis, with the idea that if you're a big pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund, or even just me with a couple index funds in your portfolio, you essentially own the universe of stocks. And therefore you care about things like externalities, where if we go back to that oil and gas example, the carbon emissions are an externality to that company, but because you own the entire global economy, you don't really have externalities. Any cost is embedded somewhere within your portfolio. So there's a lot of folks who talk about this universal owner hypothesis. I would say the institutions that have most embedded it in the way they think and the way they then act are big public pensions. So for instance, in the United States, the California Teachers Pension Plan, CalSTRS, embeds this a lot in their thinking, and some of the sovereign wealth funds, the Japanese sovereign wealth fund, and the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, Norges Bank. There's some of these big sovereign wealth funds that own nearly $1 trillion of assets have started to embed this sort of stewardship principles into what they do.
If the question you're asking, though, Liad, is kind of how do we know what the average shareholder really thinks or cares about?
The median, not the average. It's two different things.
The median shareholder actually thinks and cares about. A lot of companies wave their hands and say, "Oh, it's really complicated. Everyone cares about different things." There's actually a really great source for that. So there's a not-for-profit called Just Capital in the United States that has spent the last several years, surveying ordinary Americans and asking them, what matters to you most when it comes to corporate social responsibility? And what they found is, far and away, the thing that matters most is workers, fair treatment of workers, which is really interesting. There's the list, of course, includes things like climate change, includes things like, being fair to your customers, but workers being the top, which, from my perspective, and as someone who's got working on a business, building a business that's focused on sort of activating workers, this is just such a huge issue, and perhaps one of the biggest issues that underlies all the stuff on the people side of the people-planet divide. When you talk about inequality, you talk about disease of despair or the life expectancy issue that I raised earlier. A lot of this ties back to this, the way in which workers are treated in the United States today, and there's this terrible statistic. 50% of American workers describe themselves as disengaged, but 13%, that's 1 in 8 workers, is so disaffected by how they're treated on the job, they actively work against the interests of their companies. 1 in 8. And so there's a huge amount of, frankly, just corporate productivity and GDP that can get unlocked if we just actually enfranchise workers better and listen to them more. And so anyway, I do think that the median shareholder has spoken on these issues. For us to pretend, for corporate leadership to pretend that we don't know, I think is sort of, in some ways, willful ignorance.
Yeah, indeed. Elaine, would that you have a question? I can go on. I have a bunch of questions piling up here. Elaine, you want to ask something, or anyone?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've always got stuff to.
Yeah, I know.
So I'll confess to not having read your book, although I have got it on Kindle. I did buy it and download it, so I will get to it, but I haven't done so yet. But I guess one question I'm interested in is why you chose the term citizen capitalism. I mean, we hear a lot these days about stakeholder capitalism, World Economic Forum, and all of these other, accountants. We hear about inclusive capitalism,
conscious capitalism.
all this conscious capitalism. Yeah, we hear all of these different terms. What was behind your thinking on the words that you use? Because often the words we use, create a promise or a mindset or a expectation.
I think, Elaine, we can all agree that capitalism is in need of a modifier. That was one of the, whether it's conscious or citizen or stakeholder. But the reason why we chose the word citizen is because, well, actually, it dates back to a conversation that we had a couple of years ago with one of the advisors that we had during the book, and we were making the case that it's generally in corporations' enlightened self-interest, long-term self-interest, to think about things like the environment and their customers and their workers in long-term ways. And this person said, maybe, but doesn't it depend on where that corporation is? So he used the example, and I don't know if it's a good example or a bad example, but he used the example of Gazprom in Russia. And if the government doesn't care about their environmental abuses, and if the citizens don't care about their environmental abuses, and if shareholders locally don't care about them either, then on some level, maybe it doesn't pay to be responsible. And so what that led us to thinking was, at the end of the day, what makes sense for a corporation to do is determined by all of us. It's determined by how it'll impact the workforce. It's determined by how it'll impact customers. It's determined by what the government's likely to do or not do with regards to regulation in the future. It's determined by how investors transmit their values or don't transmit their values. And so at the end of the day, we all occupy all of those roles. Most of us occupy the role of consumer, voter, worker, and in many cases, investor as well. And so the idea of citizen capitalism is bringing your values to each of those endeavors, as opposed to what is now common in the United States, which is I work all week to make money, and then I go home, and if I've got a little extra money, I might give it away philanthropically at the end of the week. But somehow my moral and commercial lives are separate. Our view is that if we're really going to make change, we have to reunite these things, and we're seeing that happen. But it needs to happen more and faster.
Yeah, I wanna, we started at the beginning of the cooperation. I wanna quote now something from the end of your book, and you write, to rebuild trust, we must rebuild accountability, making owners accountable to corporations through stewardship codes, making corporations accountable through charters and standardized mandatory ESG reporting, making university endowment accountable to students and faculty, making all our business leaders accountable to all the stakeholders. And I do want to ask in regard to that, if you are now a CSR and a top executive and you embrace the message of your book, say, I'm going to be accountable. And then you go out and you just, look for you write standards about how you do that. And then you go and you have GRI and you have SASB and you have integrated reports, and now they're aligning, and you have the IFRS and you have the task force on climate change, and then you hold your head like, what the hell did I do to myself? How would you take them out of this model?
Yeah, it's I think the fascinating thing about working in this space right now is it looks so different than it looked 5 years ago, and we know it'll look so different 5 years from now. And the pain of being an early 5 days, and the pain of being an early adopter is that you can go to the cutting edge, state of the art reporting system today, and you're gonna have to redo it next year or the year after that when they change the standards. Now, it's not to say it's best to sit on your hands and wait, because I think there are real benefits to early movers here, where once every company in the world reports on their carbon emissions and every company in the world has a net zero 2030 or 2050 carbon goal, there will be no benefit to doing that at your business. Whereas right now, as you're saying, there's so little trust in our big corporations. Something like 3 out of 4 people don't trust corporations. 4 out of 5 people don't trust business leaders to tell the truth or generally do the right thing. That for those early adopters who actually do make the effort to muddle through the different standards and do their best to actually create businesses that reflect a deeper purpose and hold themselves accountable to that purpose, they get the benefits of starting to rebuild that trust, of creating more goodwill and commitment from workers and trust from customers. But as to what exact standards they should be following, we're going through the exact same thing in our investment firm, struggling with how do we do the most that we can. And that is the joy of being an early adopter, I suppose.
Yeah. Warren?
No, I would just say that ultimately we need to standardize all this stuff. Ultimately we need, and we went through a similar process. There was no general accounting standards back before the Great Depression. We figured out how to harmonize those. We still tweak them over time, but there's, and the difference between accounting standards in the US and in the EU, I mean, these are manageable differences. And so, I think we'll get to that place, but I do agree with Michael that without clear standards, without clear metrics, it's really hard to take stock of where we are and where we're going. And it's really hard to hold people to their stated intentions. And so I do think that the work that's being done by the World Economic Forum and the Big Four on metrics is really promising. And I'm hopeful that that'll lead to general agreement at some point.
Great. So we're gonna towards the end of our meeting. I want to ask a question now from ask your perspective now, going a little bit outside of the book, and ask a little bit about your opinion, as you're both kind of political animals. We saw that one of the first legislation that was brought up by current Congress is try to amend Citizen United court ruling, which stipulates that corporations are persons, and by that allowing them to donate to political parties. And now they're trying to turn that away, or I don't know, to change that, and taking into account the new administrative. So I just want your vision about corporate America in the coming years, taking into account about the struggle against the big four technological giants, trying to dismantle them, and with the current administration, where do corporate America goes from here?
That's a tough question, and Liat, I apologize. I've got to drop it in about a minute or two.
Okay.
But
okay.
I would just say that money in politics and corporate influence. I mean, there's probably a book in that. There's probably a book that could be written just on kind of how that all works. That's not an area of expertise, at least for me personally. As a general matter, I do think that as a general matter, I do think that the more money there is in politics, the more potential there is for abuse. But Michael might have a different perspective.
No, and I would just say, so much of our focus, like when we were talking about the median shareholder, for instance, is to say, it's not that we've got a crisis of values in our country or even in our corporations. What we have is a crisis of the transmission of those values from the ultimate shareholders that companies are meant to represent and the companies themselves. And I think that the strange thing about our current state, where corporations are spending so much money on campaigns and on candidates and interest groups, is that supposedly they are doing that on behalf of their shareholders, but many of those shareholders themselves, if given the chance to vote on it, would be abhorred that their money, their resources are being used to subvert or affect the political system in that way. So I think this is a great instance, a great example of how corporations have been disconnected from the values of their ultimate owners, from the median shareholder, and something that I hope as the capital markets, through examples like impact investing, but also through the broader trends in social responsible investing, ESG investing, get better and better at actually representing those values.
Yeah. Great. So I think we had a great discussion. Thank you. Really, there's just so many things going on right now. I think we're living in an amazing times in regards to to ESG, impact, CSR, sustainability, whatever you want to call that. I think again, congratulations on a great accomplishment with this book. With it's a really inspiration to me, and I think for a lot of practitioners, scholars in the field. Maybe we'll translate that to Hebrew one day. I have to think about that, how it can be done. I think the Israeli audience are quite thirsty for good literature about this topic, and there in Hebrew than that many. And I do want to conclude on discussion, and as you're talking now with the impact with the nation, startup nations. If you are looking for great impact in opportunities, you're gonna find them in abundance here in Israel. So I'm doing some good publications to our country here in Israel. I thank you very much, Michael and Warren, for taking this time and talking with us this your morning. And now it's going sunset here in Israel. And let's get this Corona out of the way and get back to meeting. And I can get a signature on your book.
We would love that. Absolutely, Liad. Thank you. And thank you, Liad, for your questions. And thank you for others for listening. And look forward to staying in touch.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.